Sabbath, but carrying all your belongings and even your whole house was allowed on the Shabbaton days. Carrying everything you own, going out on a journey, that was okay on the Shabbaton days, but not on the Shabbat days. So we see there's a very clear distinction between the Shabbat days and the Shabbaton days. They are not the same. A Shabbat day is not a Shabbaton day, and a Shabbaton day is not a Shabbat day, unless, of course, they would happen to fall on the same day. For example, a annual Sabbath could fall on any day of the week. So it was possible for an annual Sabbath to coincide with a Shabbat day. And at that time, of course, it would be a Shabbat day, but normally it was just a Shabbaton day. Now, I'd like to go over a few conclusions that we found so far. And I'd like to just notice, if every 15th day is already a Sabbath, a Shabbat day, why would God add a lesser restriction on top of an already existing stronger restriction? This wouldn't make any sense at all, would it? This would be like telling my son, I want you to don't eat any food whatsoever between meals. I don't want you to eat anything at all. But then telling him, I don't want you to eat anything except for vegetables. Or you can't eat anything but vegetables between meals. Now, would this make any sense? Certainly not. This would be a contradiction. I would be contradicting myself because I had already given him the command, don't eat any food at all between meals, and then on top of that telling him, I don't want you to eat any vegetables, anything except for vegetables between meals. So that would be adding a less restriction on top of an already existing greater restriction. It would make no sense at all. And I know, I'm confident that God did not do that to us. Now, also notice that those who promote the lunar Sabbath doctrine use the fact that the Shabbaton days are on the 15th of the month, 2 times in a year, and they're on the 22nd, 1 time in a year, and they use this as proof that all Shabbats should be held on the 8th, 15th, 22nd, and 29th days of every month. Now please notice a few things about this argument. This would be like comparing apples with oranges, because Shabbaton days are not Shabbat days. There is a clear distinction between them. If I would discover that all oak trees have green leaves and produce acorns, and then conclude that all green leaf trees must produce acorns, there's a flaw in my reasoning. Just because all Shabbaton days have a specific date in the month, with the exception of Pentecost, that does not mean that all Shabbat days have a specific date. To the contrary, Shabbat days are specifically left undated. There's no date given for them in Leviticus 23. And it's interesting too about this Pentecost. Pentecost is given no date whatsoever in Leviticus 23. There's a date given for everything in Leviticus 23 except for 3 things. And that is the weekly Sabbath, the wave sheaf, and the day of Pentecost. There's no date given for those because they float throughout the calendar. They can land on any day of the week. Now, I'm sorry, not any day of the week, any day of the month, forgive me. Sabbath, of course, only lands on the 7th day of the week, but it can be on any day of the month. Now, number 2, there are only 3 of the 6 Shabbaton days that match the 8, 15, 22, and 29th cycle criteria. That means half of them fall outside of that criteria. Only half of the Shabbaton days follow that, so they shouldn't be relied upon as proof for the Shabbat days. The 21st day of the 1st month, and also the 1st day of the 7th month, and the day of Pentecost all fall outside of this 8, 15, 22, 29 day criteria. Also, let's notice that the only Shabbat that is given a specific date is the Day of Atonement. That's on the 10th day of the 7th month. So if any argument for a date for the Shabbat is to be made, it must be based upon the 10th day of the month. But even that is clearly distinct from the weekly Sabbath, and we'll see that more clearly later in this presentation. Now, Number 4, there is a specific date given for everything in Leviticus 23 except for 3 things. That's the weekly Sabbath, the wave sheaf, and the day of Pentecost. This indicates that these events float on the calendar, changing dates every year. If God wanted us to keep every 8th, 15th, 22nd, and 29th days of every month, he would have told us somewhere, and especially here among all of these other dates, but there's no date given for the weekly Sabbath anywhere in the Bible. It would have eliminated a lot of confusion on this point if God had just told us to keep every 8th, 15th, 22nd, and 29th days of every month. This would have been very easy to do, but instead, God said the 7th day is the Sabbath. Exodus 20 verse 10, Leviticus 23 3, and Deuteronomy 5:14. And many times the Sabbath is called the 7th day. And this is all he told us. He left it there. He never gave us any more instruction that we should honor the Sabbath according to the moon in any way. Since the Sabbath carries a death penalty for its violation, Exodus 35:2, God has a huge responsibility for making us know what that day is. And he did this without a single mention of keeping it according to the date of the month. So what we see from this is that God has never given any instruction that we should keep the Sabbath according to the moon, but instead he tells us it is the 7th day of the week, with no instruction according to the moon or to observe the moon. Now, it would have been very easy for him to do this. You know, the 10 Commandments, when the Bible gives us the instruction on the Sabbath commandment, it just says, 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work, but the 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt do no work. So, if God wanted us to keep the 8th, 15th, 22nd, and 29th days of the month, he should have just said, and he would have just said, I want you to keep the 8th, 15th, 29th, 22nd, and 29th days of every month. They shall be Sabbaths to you. But yet we have no instruction whatsoever like this. Okay, now when Israel was in the wilderness for 40 years, God showed them and taught them about the Sabbath. And he did this. I want to ask a question. When God taught the Israelites about the Sabbath, did he use manna or did he use moon observations? Which one is the correct answer? Anybody who has taken the time to read the Bible will recognize that he used manna. He did not use moon observations at all. God used manna that fell 6 days, and then on the 6th day it always fell a double portion, and then on the 7th day no manna fell, but there was a miracle that was performed to preserve the manna so that it was still good on the 7th day. And this he did for 40 years consecutively, consistently. Every 7th day there was no manna that would fall, so that he taught the Israelites very clearly which day is the Sabbath. And he never mentioned anything about they should look up and observe the moon, and that's how they would know what day the Sabbath is. In fact, never ever once in the Bible is there any such instruction. Instead, they're just told to count 6 days of work, and the 7th day is the Sabbath. 6 days of work, 7th day is the Sabbath. And this is how the manna fell every single time. And you'll notice also that there was never a provision for a 7 or 8 days of work between Sabbaths, nor was there ever a provision that a Sabbath would last